Ian Davis and the very audience over here. My special welcome is to General Marwa and Kamal Kishore, the honorable members from the NDMA. We have a very wide different type of stakeholders present here, representatives from the various UN organizations, from academia, from NGOs. I think I see the practitioners. It would be good to start with maybe a quick round of introduction. Myself is Vikrant from Sphere India. I'll request maybe everybody, you can just introduce yourself quickly.
Shivani Bhargava from Endorsed.
Vinod Sharma, I'm Vice Chairman of Sikkim State Disaster Management Authority.
I'm Aslam Parvez from Mission Disaster Preparedness Center, Bangkok.
Also, I'm myself, Kennedy, I work with Sphere.
General Marwa, member NDMA. I am Kamal Kishore from NDMA.
P.P. Srivastava, formerly from the Northeastern Council and now a member of the advisory committee.
I'm Harshan from FEBUARY. I'm Matthew Cherin from Helpage India.
I'm Anil Sinha, formerly Vice Chairman, Bihar State Disaster Management Authority.
I'm Sunita Reddy. I teach in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Medical anthropologist and teach in public health.
I'm Rajpal. I work for Checkpoints. My name is Shyam from Emmanuel Hospital Association in India.
Myself, Juhi Priyanka Humro, PhD scholar from Jawaharlal Nehru University.
My name is Shobika. I'm an MPhil student from JNU.
Stephanie Raison from UNICEF.
Hello, I'm Salman Jacob from World Vision India.
I'm Jyotiraj from the British High Commission, Delhi.
Anirban Ganguly, British High Commission, DFID.
Yes, Kisina from Sweden.
Dr. Lina working with Sphere India.
I'm Johnson Tokno from Change Alliance.
Rajesh Upadhyay from Caritas India.
I'm Rani Sahai and I'm a consultant with UNICEF.
I'm Padmanabhan from UNDP.
Hello and very good evening to everyone. I'm Amit Tuteja from AIDMI.
Good evening everyone. I'm Shivani Rana. I'm working with Humanitarian Division, Change Alliance.
I'm Jill Davis, his wife.
Warm welcome.
So once again, I welcome you all, and we look forward to today's proceedings. Now I request Professor Vinod Menon, the former member of NDMA, to introduce Professor Ian Davis.
Good evening, friends. It's actually a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Ian Davis. Most of the people in India working in the disaster management sector for the past several years look at him as a mentor, as a guru. And it's a great pleasure and an honor for us to host him here in Delhi. And I'm all the more delighted that we have some of the best minds in disaster management practice and thought leadership in this hall today. And it's a great honor that all of you have decided and taken the time off today to come and join us in this evening. This is actually something which has happened very spontaneously. And the very fact that all these organizations came together under the leadership of Sphere India and Change Alliance indicates the kind of camaraderie and solidarity among the practitioners of disaster management in India. And we consider Professor Ian Davis as an honorary Indian because his mother was born in Ooty. And she spent the first 15 years in Nilgiris. And he has an emotional connect with India. Very much. And so whenever we used to interact with Ian, he always used to feel that the work happening in India was something inspirational. And we think that, in his sharing of his reflections for the last 45 years, because his work in disaster management started in 1972. And more than 4.5 decades of, emotional, intellectual, and academic and practitioner knowledge on what is happening in the field of disaster risk management, we have actually seen that. And his work has spanned a variety of disciplines, starting with shelter after disasters, which is his first major seminal contribution in 1978. This was actually one of the first UN guidelines on shelter after disaster, and which has come out with a recent edition in 2015. And so for the architects, the planners, his work has been extremely inspirational, and he has actually visited more than 50 disaster sites across 4 continents, and he's advised national governments, international, multilateral and bilateral agencies, and academia. And he's been an inspiration for all of us around the world working in this field of disaster management. And if I can just quickly run through some of his major highlights of his contributions. He has actually authored more than 16 books and more than 90 articles in the field of disaster management. And he is probably one of the youngest people around, in this hall, especially with young MPhil researchers and so on. I would say that Ian actually is going to be 80 next month, and it's an advanced celebration of his birthday that we are having here today. And we feel very honored that he agreed to come to Delhi to meet all of us and then spend some time here, because he was not scheduled to be coming to Delhi, but then we persuaded him and requested him and Gil to come over to Delhi and spend some time to interact with all of us. So I think that one of his most outstanding recognitions has been in 1996 when IIC recognized him with the Sasakawa Award for his outstanding contributions to the field of disaster management. And in his work in India actually started with his response to the 1978 Andhra cyclone. So from 1978 he has been associated with the disasters in India, and he has led disaster management training in many cities in India: Vijayawada, Bangalore, Calcutta, Guwahati, Mumbai, Delhi, and many other cities where we've had the opportunity to listen to him. It's a great honor and a privilege and a great opportunity for us to learn from his work, and I'm grateful that he has accepted our invitation to be here with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all very much for coming. It's a long day and you've extending it in the evening, so I do appreciate you coming, and I would like to thank the Change Alliance for so kindly helping host this gathering, and I want to thank my dear friend Vinod Menon for being my inspiration in so many ways. He's one of my ex-students, was a very lively ex-student, and I really appreciated all working with Vinod in many occasions. After the going right back to the Maharashtra earthquake of Kinari 1993, from there onwards. So it's a great privilege to be back in India. I love the country, and it's a lovely feeling being back here, smelling India again and enjoying all the good things. This morning we went to see the President's house. I've always wanted to go back inside, and that was wonderful. And tomorrow we go and see the Taj again, which is a bit of sightseeing, but also a great privilege to be here. And I just want to congratulate all of you, because you're doing great things. India is making tremendous progress in disaster risk management. And you're keeping pace with the countries are getting bigger and bigger all the time, more and more people, tremendous urbanization pressures, but somehow India is managing to develop institutions and ways of coping. So that's very impressive. You have been given a bit of paper. This is a paper I wrote last year. It's a little bit different than what I'm giving this evening, but it summarizes some of the same points. I'm going to talk, and I'm going to have questions afterwards. So if you have questions, please store them up. And I'm aware of the fact that this is a very distinguished audience with lots of people who know far, far more about many subjects than I have. And so I'm looking forward to your contributions. So the title of my talk, Vinod, can you see there, or do you want to sit where you can see better? Yeah. The title of the talk is really reflecting on these years I've spent, and it seemed appropriate that looking back on my career, it might be a good time to try and extract a few lessons. And now that I'm old, you can be quite candid and rude, and so some of the observations you will say, I don't believe that at all. That's very different than my perception. And I hope you'll explain why you feel differently a bit later on. Next, please. This is the scope of this is about the noble art of humility. After this very wonderful introduction from Vinod, I was reminded of this New Yorker cartoon which came out a few weeks ago with Mr. Donald Trump, and he's receiving his oath of office, and I'll read it in case you can't see it. And I will, to the best of my ability, which is terrific ability, by the way. Everyone agrees I have fantastic ability, so there's no problem with my ability, believe me. I'm not going to make any such claim, but it's always difficult when people say very nice things about you, because you just know how weak you are in many, many areas. And if there have been achievements in my work, I'm just so grateful for my colleagues who've enabled that to happen. Next, please. This is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try and cram into the next hour a bit about the scope of my interests, what I've been doing. I'm going to talk about some of the hats I've worn. Working for an NGO, directing 4 NGOs I've been on the board of, so I have a great love of NGOs and have worked with them all through my life, and also as an architect. There's one role I haven't had, that is working as a full-time government employee. And those of you who do work with government will notice that, and you'll see the weakness. So that's one hat I haven't had, but and so I'll talk about the way we see problems differently, wearing different hats. And then I've tried to think of 10 lessons about disaster risk management, DRM. And finally, if we have time, a little success story from Malkonji village in Maharashtra, where Mihir Bhatt and I went back with Jill and colleagues after 15 years to see what had happened. And that was very interesting. So we'll see how we go with this. And if we have to cut things out, you'll be able to get hold of the presentation later. Next, please. Next, please. Well, that's the difference. That's what the hair has got less and a bit whiter, and the beard's got a bit shorter and a bit whiter too. That's a big difference over those years. I was teaching in the School of Architecture in 1972, and somebody walked into my room and said, "Do you want to do some research?" And I said, "Well, on what subject?" He says, "Anything, as long as it's to do with building somehow. We need more staff that do work on, we need staff who have research qualifications." And I said, "Well, what do I have to do?" He says, "You have to enroll in a good university for a PhD, and you can, that's what you have to do. You choose a subject. And we will pay your fees, and we'll pay your travel, and give you time off." I said, "So what's the catch?" He said, "There's no catch. Just go for it." I said, "Well, why isn't everybody lining up to do this in my department?" He says, "Because they're all busy designing bathroom extensions." That's right. So I grabbed this with open arms, and I've been working with Tear Fund, which is linked to Ethicor, one of our colleagues here. Tear Fund, I used to do their publicity. Tear Fund was 3 people, and I used to do their posters. So I knew a little bit about disasters from my time volunteering with them. That's how I got involved. Next, please. And a few years later, wrote this book on shelter, and it was a very interesting work. The first book I'd ever written. It got translated into Spanish, and it was really trying to put down what I'd learned so far. My tutor got pretty fed up about it because it delayed my PhD, which took 12 years. It should have taken 4 or 5, but it went on and on and on. And next, please. And then later on, we had a conference on disasters in a small dwelling, and another one that came 10 years later, slowly getting more involved in reducing risk by this point. Next, please. And then the UN asked if I would write guidelines on shelter, and I said, well, I can't do that easily because I'm doing a PhD and I haven't got the strength to do this. They said, no, we're going to give you money to build a team. So I met an American called Fred Cuny, who was murdered in Chechnya a few years ago, tragically, and we assembled a little team. There was also an Indian called Aloysius Fernandez, and I don't know what happened to Aloysius, I've lost contact with him, but he was very helpful economist who helped us with that project, and we worked on that for 5 years, and it carried on being used, and it was redone, and you can get it on a website, on the IFRC website, now the revision. Next, please. PhD, that took a long time. Next, please. And then I worked with ADPC and with Brian Ward, and we wrote this disaster mitigation book in Asia and the Pacific. And that was very exciting, working on technical study with Satyendra Gupta, who helped me with that, another Indian. Next, please. I was always very interested in the way Christian faith related to it. I'm a Christian, and I wanted to see how faith could relate to disaster management. And I've always been interested in the faith-based organizations and how they cope, and the problems they have, and also the opportunities they have. And so that was a book that we wrote, and it got translated into Tagalog in the Philippines. Next, please. The rainbow represents Noah and the rainbow he saw at the end of the flood. They thought that would be a nice way to put on the cover, and they managed to spell my name wrongly on the cover, which wasn't very bright. Never mind. Next, please. This was a big effort. We produced 6 books, these are 3 of them, about how to build safely. And this was a large team was assembled, and we wanted how to communicate messages, how to establish ways of building low-cost houses, and we were then trying to, it was like a kind of commitment, which was picked up by Seeds India, by AIDMI, and different people were already working in this field of trying to communicate safety to low-cost builders and craftspeople. Next, please. This was part of the IDNTR. There was a whole decade from 1991 to 1999. It was jolly hard work. I worked for the British government, British committee on that for 9 years. And this is one of the books we produced during that period. And they led on that organization to the UN ISDR, which still exists. Next, please. We produced the thing on forecasts and warning, which was a very interesting project where we're looking at the problems of disaster warning systems, which has been one of the most successful parts of disaster planning, I think. I was just talking to a colleague a few minutes ago about the strength of warnings in northeast India, and this is one of the areas that has really prospered and grown, particularly stimulated by the tsunami and the development of the Indian Ocean tsunami warning system. Next, please. I worked with 3 geographers, Terry Cannon, Piers Blakey, and Ben Wisner, and we produced this book at risk. It was a bit of a difficult task working with, trying to all marry up 4 different people, trying to write a book together. It's not easy, because we decided each chapter would be co-authored. Every time I wrote my chapters, it came back with criticism from the other authors, and I think I wrote one chapter about 7 times. And I got so fed up with this business of every time it being corrected and changed, and in the end we almost gave up. But the book's amazingly sold well, and we'd given away the royalties, which was very generous of us, because we didn't think the book would sell at all. So we thought we can't be bothered with collecting the money. But the royalties went in 2nd edition to Oxfam, so they're still doing reasonably well out of it. You can download 3 chapters of it on the web for free. But we can't get the whole book on the web yet. Next, please. I worked with ADPC and with Zubair on community-based disaster risk management, and I think that's been a very productive area of development in disasters, seeing how communities can manage risks themselves. And that became a very strong focus in ADPC's work, and if you don't know about ADPC, it's a very strong organization based in Bangkok. Next, please. And this embarked on a study of disaster recovery, and this is where I worked closely with Anil Sinha, who's here, because he was chairing the disaster recovery, I don't know what it was called, Annie, or what was it?
Platform,
International Recovery Platform, that's right, based in Kobe. And this was the product of it, and that eventually led to a book that I wrote. Next, please. An invitation came from the IPCC to work with them on trying to marry up the disaster community and the climate change community. And there were about 120 of us. We met in Panama and Australia and Geneva and Vietnam, and we were trying to see how these two communities could work together. And it was a very interesting time and a very tense time because many people on the group were very angry. I remember one man saying, you know, you can debate climate change, but I'm a victim of it. I live in the Maldives and my island has gone already and we're going to have to go and live in New Zealand. And I said, I don't want to live in New Zealand, but that's what will have to happen. So he said, you can talk about this in abstract terms. He said, but for us in the Maldives, this is happening. And we're really fed up about it because, first of all, we can be wrecked by colonialism by the Western powers, and now you're wrecking us with your carbon. So we had some very tough meetings in that group, and it gave me a real awareness of just how serious climate change is and why it makes me so angry that we've got these climate change deniers even sitting in the White House. Next, please. Better not talk about that, it will get me going. Next, please. This was another study. These were two done in recent years. Next, please. And this was the Shelter revised book. It was interesting. I said, "Why do you want to revise the thing?" We did it back in 1983, and it's out of date. He says, "Well, we like it because we liked your principles, and we like particularly Principle 1." Which says that the primary resource in shelter comes from the surviving community themselves. Other people can help, but they must avoid duplicating what survivors do. He said, we like the emphasis. We like the emphasis on a survivor-based response, not victims. Call them survivors because it has more dignity. And so we updated it, and it was a big effort, but that's, I hope, going to have more added to the life of that study. I owe very much to my colleagues. It was a team effort. Next, please. Right. Now, wearing a variety of hats, each roles provided different views of a subject. Next. My role as an architect, although they don't wear hats like that very often, NGO board member, sitting on the board of various NGOs, as an academic in a few universities, consultancy, and also as an individual. One hat I haven't put on is painter or artist, because I've painted a lot, and I found that very useful, particularly in northern Pakistan. When you do drawings of buildings, you get a lot of people behind you who watch your drawing, and they're very interested, and they engage in conversation with you. The drawing has the opposite effect to a camera. People like looking at it, and I found drawing a very good way of getting information from people. So maybe another hat ought to go on there. Next, please. So the architect role, that was particularly involved in the design and study of shelters and safe settlements and of reconstruction, and that's persisted right through, and I'm still very interested. Jill's son's an architect, my son's an architect, surrounded by architects, so we think a lot about architects. And one advantage architects have is that they think in multidisciplines. They have to keep thinking about how a social worker thinks about their house, or how a technical person, how acoustic, a landscape. You have to work in a team, and that's equipped me rather well for disaster work. And the other thing about being an architect is that you have to make decisions all the time. This size of room, that wall material, this height, and you have to always make decisions without enough information. So, and that's true of everyone working in disasters. You never have enough information. The second one was an NGO board member in four organizations. As an academic, both in teaching at academic level and running lots of training courses, which is where I met Vinod, and a colleague here. We did a very nice course together, an interesting course in Kolkata. Can't pronounce it properly now. I called it Calcutta, but we did it there with Oxfam in India, and that was back in '91. Many courses, a lot of consultancy, and some of the personal conflicts. Next, please. We see things differently depending on different viewpoints. The man on the island can see a boat. Ah, wonderful, a boat. The man in the boat sees land. Oh, how wonderful, I'm going to be rescued. Whatever our background, we see things in a different way. And when I first started work in disasters, next please, I used to sort of move from doing academic work to sitting in a boardroom of an NGO and seeing the subject completely differently from different standpoints. I had a Chinese professor came to work with me in Oxford, and he walked into my room one day and said, I hate your English word for disasters, it's very bad, isn't it? I said, well, disasters are pretty bad. He said, no, I know, of course I know they're bad. He said, I know they're bad, but your word is bad. We have a much better word in Mandarin for crisis. And if a Chinese person uses the word crisis, they think of two roots. One is danger, and the other is opportunity. So whenever you say the word crisis to a Mandarin-speaking person, they can always see the way out. They can always see an opportunity. He said, when you hear the word disaster in English, it's all bad. It's a very nice observation, that the actual terminology can affect your thinking. Regarding disasters as opportunities, in India many things have happened in India as a result of disasters. Next, please. John Rockefeller, I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity. I was involved with the Italian earthquake in 1980, and I got a phone call one day from somebody dealing with prefabricated housing and said, would I help them develop prefabricated housing for the earthquake victims? I said, well, I'm not sure that's quite what we need, because we need buildings which will generate local labour. And if you bring in prefabricated housing from Milan or from Britain or from Germany, that doesn't do much for the local economy. He said, well, no, but we can see opportunities here. And then I got a phone call saying, we're having an exhibition in London, would you come and join us for the opening and for the big dinner? So I went, next please, I went to this thing, and right across the room, in letters about 2 meters high, this placard was written across this huge conference, one man's disaster, another man's marketing opportunity. It looked really, really grim. I thought, what a horrible say. But of course, he was correct. And I questioned it, and he said, well, you're an architect, you're doing rather well out of disasters, aren't you? So I thought, well, I better shut up, because I can see that one man's tragedy can generate work for another. We look differently at problems from different standpoints. Next, please. An architect, one of the biggest things I've learned, I think, is that we need to think more about process. Process is a very... Please come in. There's some seats down here.
Yeah, please come to the front.
Plenty of seats. Very nice to welcome you. Thank you. If you're trained as an architect or as a designer, you tend to think in finite terms of a product. You're designing a building, a town, a room, a structure, and you think of it like that. But in the disaster field, it's the process which often really matters. So we use the word sheltering, not just shelter. How does that sheltering happen? Well, it happens by people taking action. So we think a lot about process. And one of the things I've learned is that architectural students are not taught much about processes. They're taught much more about products. Next, please. Here's a little diagram. It really, the red line at the top, one end says process and the other end says product. I'm not saying that, and an architect's involved with both things, process as well as product. The process end, you're involved with providing minimum support to a community or an individual to get back on their feet. If you're doing produce, maximum provision. That's the extent of it. You provide them with a temporary house, you provide them with a tent, you provide them with a house, you do the whole thing for them. And they can be very passive and receive the whole lot, and it can be very expensive. But at the other end of it, you might provide technical support, or you might provide rent support so they can rent somewhere. And so what this diagram is trying to show is that there are two ways in which providing help. And I must say, I go down the left-hand one, where the conditions, where the people are very poor. And when we were working in Haiti, it was particularly important to emphasize the support role rather than the provision role. And yet the agencies want to provide. They want photographs. The politicians want to provide. They want photographs and they want to cut ribbons for the opening of the property. And so there's often a bit of a conflict between these two positions. But I'm not saying there's no need for provision, but there's a need for both. And we need to correct much of the emphasis to go down that support road. Back to that principle. The primary resource in the provision of shelter is from the survivors themselves. Outside groups can help, but they must avoid duplicating what the survivors can do. If you go down the process route, you come for outcomes. If you go down the product route, you come for outputs. Very different. Next, please. Architects have had a fairly troubled past with disasters. One of the most famous houses in the world is by Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the most famous American architects. And he had a millionaire client who owned a ravine in Pennsylvania, not too far from Pittsburgh. And he wanted a summer house. And he liked this waterfall and said, would you build a house where I can see the waterfall? Well, Frank Lloyd Wright built the house on top of the waterfall, so you couldn't actually see the waterfall from the house. But he and the River Authority heard about his plan, and they wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright saying, we don't think this is a good idea at all. You shouldn't build a house in the middle of a deep ravine, because the house will get wrecked, because this place is subject to flash flooding. And Wright wrote back a personal, insulting letter to them saying, don't you realise I'm the most famous architect in the world, and I do what I please? And don't write ignorant letters to me telling me how to design buildings. And then his engineers protested. The engineers said, you shouldn't build this, Mr. Wright, this is very dangerous, because this building, it will undermine the foundations. They built it in 1936. I used to lecture on architecture. I used to talk about organic architecture and the wonders of this building, because it's a spectacular building. And it's been voted by the American Association of Architects the most famous house in the world. But it's been destroyed 3 times in flooding. The flooding rampaged through it. On one occasion, Edgar J. Kaufman's son was in the house when it happened, and he describes the terror of the water pouring through the house. But they were millionaires, and they rebuilt it each time. And they keep on rebuilding it. The house is still there. So when I give lectures now, I talk about land use planning and unsafe planning policies. I don't talk about organic architecture anymore. Next, please. This is interesting. Supply-driven is when a manufacturer or designer or a planner ends up with, or an agency, they have an answer, but it's waiting for a problem. They've already got the answer. Supply-driven is always based on assumptions that are competently used in developing a given product. Supply-driven may be based on a wrong paternalistic stance. We know what you ignorant and passive victims actually need. Next, please. Haiti. All sorts of emergency houses being offered. And they put them all in a kind of museum, which was a good place to put them. So there's a kind of open-air museum of all these different models. Next, please. Weird and wonderful houses made of cardboard, made of polystyrene, made of plastic. Some of them can be delivered by helicopters. They often cost 12 times what a local house could cost. Next, please. When I was active in the university, I got letters all the time from people saying, I've invented the ultimate shelter. Can you please suggest that the world takes it on? You can't argue with these intrepid inventors. I'm sure, Kamal, when you were working you had the same kind of letters. You're an architect working in ADPC, and people wanted these instant houses. Didn't that happen?
Okay. Still happens.
So what do you say to them?
Try it.
Next, please. One day a postman came to my house when I was teaching in Oxford, and the secretary said, there's a man downstairs with a bicycle and a trailer, and he wants you to go down and meet him. She said, he's a postman, and he's got an emergency shelter to show you. And when I got down to the car park, he was erecting a shelter which was in his trailer. And he said, you know, I've cycled all around Europe, I've been to Brussels, I've been to Geneva, and I've got this shelter which is the solution to the world's housing needs. I want your sponsorship for it. And by that time, a big crowd was developing as he erected his shelter. This poor guy, he was quite convinced he had the answer to all the problems he saw on TV, but otherwise he hadn't bothered to find out what the needs were. I was even involved in a British project of British government DFID, or it's what was there before it, and this was it, an industrial designers designed a shelter which was like a re-entry vehicle, where a family could sit in a sort of prone position in a row, all 5 of them. And they couldn't stand up in this shelter, and you couldn't go to the toilet in the shelter, you couldn't drink, you just sat there like on a sofa watching TV. And that was the shelter. And the argument was this shelter would float in a flood, and this shelter would stand up to any earthquake. I said, well, they're 2 of the factors, but there are plenty more, I believe you me. And so we gave it the thumbs down, and it caused great annoyance to the British government because they were going to sponsor this idiotic design. Next, please. So the conclusions about the architect's role. I've got conclusions about each of these. Architects need to be educated and commissioned to consider process, where they can enjoy sharing and enhancing the creative process with the public they seek to serve, rather than they always demanding the design role. Let other people design. Let them have a go at it. Everybody can be a good architect, a good designer. Architects and other professions need to recognize the value of support roles when working with active, vulnerable families, in comparison with more expensive provision. Support leads to outcomes, while provision can lead to outputs. So trying to get an outcome for a community out of a good shelter policy, it can be very exciting. Next, please. So I worked on an NGO board, and sometimes it was very painful. I remember once sitting in a board meeting for an unnamed agency, and we were discussing budgets, and the finance director was asked to speak, and he said, you know, we haven't got enough money for the next quarter, and we're going to have to offload staff. So we're developing contingency plans for which staff are going to have to be made redundant in the next 3 months. He said, but, you know, we might have a disaster. And if we have a disaster, we'll get 14% of all the money that comes in, and we won't need to have any redundancies. So he said, this might happen, with a very cheerful grin on his face. I wished I'd said to him, I'd like that again in dictation speed, if you don't mind, because it was a really dreadful thing to have said, but he just was looking at the self-interest of the disaster to help rescue the NGO. It gave me a chill, but he was seeing it from the standpoint of the organisation. Another thing I have a gripe about NGOs, and this could be a gripe against myself, because I didn't raise it when I was a director of them. They make appeals after disasters, and they often say, these people in Maharashtra or Kathmandu need your help, they're desperate. Please send your money, this is the bank account, this is the bank details, and we need your money now because we're doing this effective work. They don't say, the people in Kathmandu are doing a remarkable job surviving. They're mobilized to do wonderful things, but please help them in that process. Please give your support to the local community. They never say that. They never said that in 40 years. I've never seen any advert which has ever mentioned the local capacity. And I think NGOs can sometimes feel that they are the real protectors of the poor, and the governments aren't. Next, please. But I just have to say that NGOs have been in the forefront of policy innovations, and they filled many of the gaping cracks left by governments, UN organisations and the private sector. So I'm not hammering NGOs, I love them and have worked with them. But there are 1 or 2 of these things which need fine-tuning on. Next, please. My professor, who supervised my PhD, he always used to say this again and again, remember, relief is the enemy of recovery. I thought he was mad. I thought relief was Mother Teresa. I thought relief was the Good Samaritan. I didn't understand what Königsberg was getting at. But he was obsessed by paternalism. And he felt that relief can become patronizing, and it can make people passive. And you must get out of relief. Don't let them get down that road. And he also felt that too much money was spent on relief, and you needed that money later. You needed it in recovery and reconstruction. And I think that still applies. Next, please. And the other person who had a big influence was Henry Quarantelli, who's one of the leading sociologists in the world. He's a very sick man now, he's in his 90s, and, but he had a great influence on me, and I first met him just before going to my first fieldwork. And he was very kind. He spent 3 days with Russell Dines explaining disasters to me in Columbus, Ohio. He took me to the airport when I was about to leave in 1973 to go down on my first fieldwork. And he came to the departure gate and said, "Do you need some advice?" I said, I need all the advice possible, Mr. Quarantelli. I don't know anything about this subject. When you arrive in Managua to study the earthquake, you'll become aware that there's been a massive overestimate of damage and dislocation, and an equally massive underestimate of local resources to cope with the situation. So I said to him, how do you know? He said, "Well, I've worked in disasters for 25 years. He says, I don't see why this one should be any different from any of the others. I said, "Well, why is there this exaggeration you talk about?" He said, "Well, you're the student, you better tell me." So I sort of hummed and hawed. And I said, "Is it because the media exaggerated?" He said, "Yes." He says, "To sell newspapers and get people on to watch TV. Of course they exaggerated." "Is it because of the NGOs want to attract money?" He said, "Yes, everybody wants to attract money." He says, "And the more you can hype it up, the more you're going to get." And he went on like this, and it was just an interesting observation. I don't think it always happens, but there is that tendency to hype up things and make them seem a lot worse. When I got to Nicaragua, I was suddenly aware of just how strong all these people were beavering away at things. And they weren't waiting for anybody to help them. On the contrary, it was extraordinarily energetic. Next, please. And these capacities are huge, and this is really why I'm surprised that NGOs don't talk about capacities when they make their appeals, because they have capacity building programs. So many NGOs are spending a lot of energy on capacity building. Think of the capacities: cash reserves, memories of past events, volunteering, all the opportunities that come with capacities, and they're phenomenally big and great. So the job of an NGO as I get older and older is to mobilize those capacities and liberate them and work with them and see how they can be channeled more effectively, and to look for the gaps. Where are the gaps? Not to duplicate them, but how to strengthen them. For example, in recent years, one of the big capacities of people is mobile phones. People can run their own relief program by phoning from a relative in some other country and ask for money by Western Union now. And in Haiti, far more money came in by the diaspora contributing than any relief agency. So we're seeing a situation where you've got mobile phone technology and you've got a huge percentage of poor people with it. In Haiti, the poorest country in the Western world, with 98% ownership of mobile phones. So they were managing their own program. We've also seen mobile phone technology in our guide telling us where people go after disasters, and Digicel have got mapping, so you can see which families they went to stay with. We're learning a lot from that, but the mobile phone is now producing a quite phenomenal resource for people. Next, please. A few conclusions about the NGO role. NGOs, as well as all agencies and individuals offering disaster assistance, need to recognize that their self-interest must never distract them from the vital core function, assisting survivors and reducing risk, but never duplicating what they can undertake. They need to apply the Red Cross Code of Conduct that they've all signed. 600 of them have signed it. And one of the codes of conduct is to give accurate information in their appeals concerning the strength of the surviving communities and how this capacity could be supported, even if such humility might result in reduced donations. That last bit is very important. Some overconfident international NGO officials need reminding that they're accountable to any host government where they're operating as guests, and where the national local government needs to lead and manage the recovery process. I led a workshop in England for one of the world's largest agencies, which brought their elite team of people from all over the world. And we had 2 weeks of them together. We did exercises and simulations. I won't tell you the name of the organization. And they asked me to sum up at the end of 2 weeks. And I said, you know, I've been here with you for 2 weeks. We've enjoyed it, we've drank a lot of beer together, we've seen lots of exercises, it's been a terrific experience. I said, but you know, I haven't heard the word government in 2 weeks. You haven't mentioned government. You haven't mentioned supporting government or working with government. You've just talked about yourselves and the NGO sector. Why have you ignored government? And then they trotted out some of the stereotypes about government corruption, how we need to, they need us and all the rest of it. But I realized they would see themselves like the guardians of the poor. They were the force that looked after the poor, and they had no recognition of the need to see how you can work together with other key stakeholders. Next, please. So as an academic, what are the pressures and problems? Well, pretty strong financial pressure now in Britain and in Europe and the US to run courses, to recruit students, to secure research contracts and get lucrative consultancies. And these pressures can result in staff without the necessary expertise, teaching and training. And there's a big pressure in Western countries to run training courses, say in Britain or in Brussels or in Canada or the US, when those training courses should really be in country. That's where they need to be. And we need to stop all that money staying within these countries. Next, please. Next, please. There's me holding for training courses. The development of skills through training is probably the greatest investment in a safe future that anyone can make. May I just make one statement, which is probably the most important part of this talk. I've often thought about where do you get the most bangs for your buck? Where do you get the most value from your investment if you're a donor? If we're in a flood-prone area and we want to stop that flood, we can spend money on flood protection. We can build flood walls. We can set up an early warning system. We can set up all manner of ways to minimize the flood. But that can only reflect the technology of 2017. It cannot reflect the technology of 2024 or 2050. It's limited by what we know. If you train somebody in 2017 and you train them really well, and you're developing their problem-solving capacity and you're developing their ability to synthesize and to grasp a problem and solve it, in 2000, maybe 30 years later, 25 years later, that person is still benefiting from the training they got now. So training is investing deep into the future. It's unlike any other form of provision. So I'm always staggered to see donors not giving it the attention it deserves. Training, education. It's just about the most important thing you can do. And that can go from primary school right up the whole line to adult continuing education. So I've just summarised that same point there about the importance of training. We once ran a course and I went round the room asking them all why they'd come, and one chap from an African country said, well actually I've come here as a punishment because I haven't performed well in my work and they've sent me here as a punishment. In my country they regard training as a very, very weak thing to do. He says, and if you can't do anything else you become a trainer. And this poor guy had been sent to the course because he hadn't performed well. Probably quite a good reason he came, but I thought what a terrible attitude towards something as exciting as training. So I do love training, and I think the more, and it's a bit sad to see it declining in some organisations. Next, please. In higher education, we've got a real problem here because a lot of people are doing master's courses and PhD work, and many of the people supervising this are not really up to the job. And in the past 10 years, I think on 7 occasions, I've been involved in assessing PhDs by people who were badly led by their supervisors. On one occasion, somebody had not studied any of the literature in Turkish. His study was a Turkish earthquake. No literature in Turkish that he looked at. Everything was in English, despite the fact his wife was Turkish, so he could have read it by translation. So I read the PhD. It took me 3 days to read this thing. And that was a big question. Why is there no reference to any Turkish literature? And then when I got a bit further on, I realized he hadn't consulted with anybody who knew about Turkish earthquakes. He hadn't been to any Turkish university where they were studying the problem, and there were 4 world-class universities studying exactly his problem. Didn't seem to know about it. Sat down with the examiners for a very awkward lunch, And they said, well, what do you think? Tried to soften me up. And I said, well, is there a reason why he hasn't read any Turkish literature? They said, that's because there isn't any. I said, well, with respect, you're entirely wrong, because I have a Turkish colleague and she brings in Turkish books, and we've got about 1 metre of Turkish books on our bookshelves. Colossal. They write beautifully about it. And why hasn't he visited any research centres? He said we didn't know there were any. And then the other examiner said, to be honest, the reason he didn't is because we don't know about it. And yet they supervised a PhD. And then one of the examiners said, who do you think you're supervising? You're examining us or the student? It got very difficult from there on. and that is not untypical. Very serious problem in Britain. And it's going on in Britain, and it's happening in Europe, and it's happening in the US. And people are not being careful enough when they choose their universities to make sure they've got somebody who knows the subject well enough to teach it. And the universities are being greedy and taking on people when they're not ready for it, and running master's courses with people who don't know the subject well enough. Next, please. Consultancies. One of the problem is that consultancy is often seen as a political device for hairpin bend finance. The money goes from Britain to India via a British consultant, and the British consultant does the work, and the money stays in Britain. Not unusual, not at all unusual. And one of my friends, Dr. Rabin in Bangladesh, every lecture he gives, he talks about what he calls consultancy colonialism, where he talks about this problem of the money not staying, not going to the country where it belongs, and staying with consultants. He says, why pay a consultant sort of $1,500 a day when you can get a good consultant from the country for a fraction of that amount of money, and you can help develop the capacity of the country? Next, please. So we've got a problem. Here's a cartoon about it, where someone says these poor consultants are coming down in a parachute, which isn't opening, by the way. They're about to crash. And one of these poor disaster victims saying, thank God for that panel of experts, which is about to arrive. And so it's a very nasty jibe at experts coming in to help with disaster relief, but it has a ring of truth to say about it. Next, please. Expensive foreign consultants are often hired rather than local experts who better understand local dynamics and local culture. This is for foreign donors to keep aid money in their own country. The effect is that essential aid does not reach the rightful target, and local expertise is neglected and not developed. This persistent problem in being a consultant concerns the difficulty in offering independent professional advice. Consultants are often hired by bodies. They've already determined the policy they wish to pursue, so the consultant can be expected to support their position. I've had that happen many times. I've been told what to write, and I hadn't realised when I took on the consultancy, and somebody would sidle up to me in a room where I'm working and say, by the way, what we want is for an endorsement of this, and a piece of paper is handed to me. I said, well, I don't agree with that policy. He said, well, if you want any more consultancy, you better agree to it. The bread and butter of a consultant's income requires they please their clients to secure repeat business. This is a bit cynical, I know, but I have had dream consultancies which haven't been like this at all, completely independent, but there's always this kind of tension. Next, please. Personal conflicts. Well, how to balance the quest for ambition and money and prestige, which we all have, versus a sense of vocation and service to those who are vulnerable or in acute need. And this ties in with the question of to whom am I accountable? Getting very personal now. Next, please. The conclusions are that to balance these two things, it has to come from the deeply held core values which each of us lives by. In my case, I'm a Christian and try and live by the teaching of Jesus Christ, but that's sometimes very difficult, and I've often failed. For other people, it comes from their worldview or from their religious belief or their ethical standards. Next, please. Well, I'm going to come back to that when I talk a bit about accountability a bit later on, but I better move on. Time's going by, and I want to now go on to part 3 of this talk by talking about an assumption and 10 lessons. I'm going to go through this very fast. Next, please. Well, the assumption is this, that disaster risk management is extremely worthwhile. In fact, it's essential in all societies where there's hazards. But, there's a but. Next. The but is this. DRR is a wicked problem. Highly difficult to solve because of... can anyone read what it says there? I can't get my specs on.
Incomplete military knowledge.
First item. Second one, could you read that?
The number of people and opinions involved.
Third one?
A large economic burden.
Yes.
The fourth one is the interconnected nature of these problems with other problems.
So disaster risk reduction is complicated, and it's a bit like that ball of interwoven agendas, and there are many difficulties with it, which have often been played down. Next, please. Here's an early cartoon from the 19th century of Old Father Thames. That's this man falling around in the water with a pot on his head. And he's shouting at London. London is the lady who looks a little bit like Margaret Thatcher. And he's saying to her, it ain't my problem. Isn't it somebody's business to tuck me up in bed? And what the cartoon is saying is, why don't we have flood walls? Why don't we contain this river? And eventually London got flood walls, but this was one of the cartoon was campaigning. Next, please. Well, London did get flood walls. It got a Thames barrier, and it got walls which go down 80 miles to the sea. And it's this barrier, which is at Greenwich, keeps being opened because the flood risk has grown and grown in London. And the flood risk is still there despite the barrier, because those flood walls which go down on either side of the river, they've got gates in them. If only takes one of these gates that allow boats, access to boats for the police and for emergency services, if only one gate is left undone in the wet season in winter time, that London could be flooded by the back door. So human error is really at risk. London gets about 700, is protected against a 700-year flood. Across the North Sea in Holland, Holland is protected against a 3,500-year flood. Holland gets a hugely more higher factor of safety than London. Hull in the north of England gets a 200-year flood safety. So why the difference? And the answer is levels of acceptable risk and what is politically acceptable. And we'll probably see in the future as sea level rise, these levels of protection change very dramatically, and London will get much better protection. One day of the London Underground being out of action, you run into billions of US dollars damage, and so London has to be protected. It's a vital part for our country, and you have the similar strategic things that need protecting here in Delhi, seat of government, and in commercial centres like Mumbai. They require, the whole city requires, it's like a critical facility for the whole of the country. Next, please. DRR is a remarkable thing. It can do all sorts of things. In Davos, not very far from where the World Economic Summit happens, there's this remarkable church which is shaped like a boat. And it's got a prow on the end of the church, and this church had been demolished 3 times in avalanches, and so they rebuilt it with a great big kind of prow on the front, so that if a snow comes clattering down, it won't destroy the church. They built that in 1680. The church has never had an avalanche since, so the DRR has been sitting waiting for this to happen. But it's still a remarkable bit of adaptation. It's probably the only church in the world which is avalanche proof. Maybe avalanche proof, maybe not, because the avalanche might come sideways on, or it might be much more severe. Next, please. I've learned that disaster risk management is severely neglected and underfunded in comparison with emergency management. Königsberger was right, relief is the enemy of recovery. It's not helped by misleading terminology, a bit more about that later. I don't think it's possible to calculate the precise costs of DR, disaster risk management, or of the savings. So when people say you can get 9 times return on DRR measures, I'm not sure what the basis of their arguments is, or their cost-benefit calculations. Next, please. I think that disaster risk management is of limited effectiveness unless the root causes of vulnerability are faced and tackled. We had a meeting in Geneva, and when Margareta Wallström was the head of UNISDR, she presented the report on risk, and I stood up and said, what about the no-go areas? And she said, what do you mean, Ian, no-go area? I said, well, all the areas that are not mentioned in your book. And she said, like what? I said, well, like gender discrimination. I said, that affects risk. People's not being given information about risk. Corruption levels. And I started going down my list, and she said, well, these are sensitive areas which are difficult for the UN to comment on. Well, I'm sure they are, but somebody's got to comment on them, and somebody's got to address them, because these are the driving forces, the risk drivers behind many of our problems. Unsustainable urbanization, even explosive population growth in some countries like Nigeria and Pakistan, where you've got this massive growth of population in a very vulnerable country. So we've got to tackle these no-go areas, and someone's got to say that unless we tackle them, we're going to get more and more disasters happening. It's no good just dealing with unsafe conditions. You've got to tackle these root causes. Next, please. Disaster risk reduction is undertaken by many groups outside the DRM community. A bit more about that later. It's difficult to mainstream, and it's far too complicated and diverse to be fully coordinated from a single focal point. 3 more, next. Disaster risk management is more of a culture or a way of life rather than an agenda, a strategy or a program. It's in need of priority concern to raise awareness through training and education at all ages, all levels, all sectors. And lastly, it's often undertaken by officials who are accountable to those who are accountable to those they serve, but they're unaccountable to those who are at risk, needing protection. I'll run through these again fairly quickly now, see how we get on. I didn't start about quarter, so I'll just keep going. Right, next please. It's neglected and underfunded. Next. 5 times as much was spent on emergency response from 1991 to 2010 than to disaster risk reduction. Well, I'm not sure if I believe that, because I don't know how they calculate how much is spent on disaster risk reduction, because that can be far more than people realise. Come on to that a bit later. Next, please. Some of the terminology is very misleading. Let me look at next, please. A few comments about that. Next, please. Yes, the word disaster prevention. I never like that word. It's inaccurate because hazard risks are unlimited in scale. They could be vast, and resources are always limited. If the hazards can be huge and vast and beyond our expectations, as happened with the tsunami in 2004, and the resources are limited, how can we say prevention? It's very arrogant to say we can prevent disasters. We can reduce them, we can minimize them, we can take action for them, but to say we prevent them gives a false sense of security. A friend of mine, a geographer, the editor of a magazine on disasters, said he doesn't like the word hazard because it implies danger. He said, why call a flood a hazard? Floods are necessary, they're vital for the whole biosystem, for the whole ecosystem of a country. And the word mitigation is now difficult to use by anybody because the climate community talk about meaning cutting carbon emissions. And we talk about it for a program for teaching primary kids about earthquakes. So the word's used differently by 2 communities which are often in the same bed. Next, please. So, for example, volcanoes have the asset of providing fertile soils and geothermal power, but they cause all manner of problems. Earthquakes are the building blocks of our planet, but they cause extreme damage. Cyclones provide a deluge over dry tropical lands, but they cause damage. I had a friend coming on one of our courses from Mauritius, and he said, you know, we pray to God for cyclones. I said, do you? He said, yes, but we don't want them too close. As long as they're out at sea, because we need that water, we need that deluge. Our whole ecosystem requires that water. He said, and it's a fantastic provision. He said, but just keep them a bit away. Floods. irrigation, fertilization, transfer of silt, they cause damage. So floods are a part of the same system. And bushfires, in fact, are essential for even germination of certain crops. Vinod, you know about all this stuff, both Vinods, about the way in which these hazards can cause our essential part of an ecosystem. Next, please. It's difficult to calculate the precise cost because they're not calculated. For example, many of the people who design earthquake-resistant buildings go through expensive training in their engineering courses, and that would have to be costed in terms of the cost of an earthquake-resistant building, and the costs of all the development of codes would have to be costed. If you're working about floods, you've got a catchment area, and that catchment is involving irrigation, land drainage, flood control, and nobody's costing all these different activities. They're vast in scale by different communities. And so the idea that you can actually calculate how much is spent on disaster risk reduction, I think, is a great big myth. It's vastly more than anyone realizes, and it's a colossal amount of any society's expenditure. But we don't know what it is, and we never will. For example, when I'm designing a building as an architect, part of it might be earthquake-resistant construction. But there's other parts of it which are keeping the rain out, or other parts of it are the lighting system. And the calculation of the cost of the building doesn't break down which part of it is for earthquake resistance. You get total figures. So nobody knows when a building is completed, how much is to do with disaster risk reduction, and how much is just general building work. Next, please. Thank you very much. I think this was a famous statement which goes back to 1732. A stitch in time may save 9. Well, it may save much more than 9. Next, please. This was a calculation done by a British group. For every dollar invested, it saves 7. It might save much more than that. We don't know, and we probably never will. Next, please. We have developed this crunch diagram, and the crunch diagram is the hazards on one side and the vulnerability on the other. And we used to say the vulnerability side is all to do with human intervention, and the other side is natural. But we've had to revise the diagram because of climate change, and so we have on the top part of it climatic, hydrometeorological disasters, where there's human activity, and we have what's called anthropogenic forcing. So we're seeing human action both sides of this equation, and then in the middle, the crunch. And the thing I was talking about earlier, if you have these underlying causes out at the edge, that's where we've got things like corruption. And if you don't address the corruption, you're going to carry on getting these unsafe conditions. And the political class want to deal with the unsafe conditions, often without addressing these underlying causes, which are so difficult. Next, please. One of the first no-go areas, gender discrimination. Next. Explosive population growth. Next. Unsustainable urbanization rates. Next. High levels of corruption. Let's just think of this for a moment. This is the next one, please. This is the Transparency International's corruption map of the world. The more yellow, the less corrupt. Finland does about the best, I think, and New Zealand. We're not so good in Britain, but when it gets really nasty, like North Korea or Somalia, you get a very big purple splodge. And so every year, the Transparency International, an NGO in Berlin, produce this map, and they identify the most corrupt countries and keep them up to date. Next, please. Nick Abrazes was one of the greatest earthquake engineers that we know of, and he died a few years back. In 1976, at one of our conferences, he says, tomorrow's act of God, today's act of God is likely to be regarded as tomorrow's act of criminal negligence. And he's absolutely right. And many engineers are in prison now because of their faulty designs. In fact, 13 supervisors of building controls were executed in China because they let down the community in Sichuan where the earthquake happened, and they met their fate. Next, please. But this man Ambrosies and Roger Bilham, who works with British Geological Survey, and he works with the USGS, they've calculated that 83% of all deaths from building collapse over the past 30 years occurred in countries that were assessed as corrupt by Transparency International. They're saying that the cause of disaster deaths is closely correlated with corruption. Next. Another nasty piece of information: after the 2004 tsunami, PricewaterhouseCoopers were commissioned to investigate the funding of relief and recovery in Sri Lanka. They found that 60% of all funds received from NGOs, from government, from the UN were unaccounted for. They admitted that some of that might have been funds being taken from one account and not put back with poor bookkeeping, but they assume that a vast amount entered Swiss bank accounts. If the public knew that, they'd never give again to any appeal. Next, please. To avoid corruption, there are things that can be done. We can educate, we can develop professional standards, we can pay proper wages for enforcement officials, and we must make sure the government sets the best example. And we could enlist the support from religious bodies of all faiths and civil society for this campaign, to get the mullahs in the mosques, to get the priests, to get the officials in our temples to actually preach the same message. This is unacceptable for the society. We need to have coalitions to fight for better anti-corruption measures. Next, please. We've had that already. Next. I don't know how that slipped in. So DRM is of limited effectiveness unless we get down to dealing with these kind of problems. Next. People need to be told about the risks they face. If the government have information about risk, they must share it with those at risk. That was a big moan I had when I was in Sichuan talking to the Chinese there, because they weren't told about the risks they faced. And they're still not being told in China about it. So this is a very serious problem. Next, please. Lots of people are involved in disaster risk who are outside the DRM community. They might be engineers, they might be river officials, and they have nothing to do with DRM, but they're doing it every day of the year. So there's a much bigger community than is represented by conferences like this one, or what happens, people who subscribe to UNISDR conferences, such as the one they had last year in Sendai. Next, please. So a high proportion of DRR work exists outside the overview of government, outside ISDR's influence. And that is in building engineering, in food security, river catchment management. So let's have a bit of humility. Next, please. Sixth lesson, DRM is exceedingly difficult to mainstream. This has been the mantra for many years, and I've written about it, and everybody's written about it, and people in this room are trying to do it, but it's difficult. Next, please. It's difficult to get a disaster plan to integrate with other sectors like education and agriculture and economics and so on and so forth. Next, please. There is a need to mainstream it wherever possible into policy, structures, curriculum. It's absolutely vital for the education ministries to look after safe schools and school safety. And we need that approach. We need this piggyback approach of getting disaster risk into the society via these other groups. Next, please. But there are great problems. And I went to a conference in Canada, and Stephen Lewis, who was the UN Secretary General for HIV and AIDS in Africa, wrote about the problem of mainstreaming. Not about disasters, but in relation to the needs of women in Africa, in relation to the HIV crisis. And this is what he wrote. Next. Does mainstreaming work? Next. I don't know why that's got in twice either. I don't know who thought up all this mainstreaming guff, but I often wonder what their motives were. And even if the motives were well-meaning, surely experience has proved how damaging to women's mainstreaming truly is. We've mainstreamed women's needs into some kind of shibboleth, and can someone tell me how those needs have been better served by doing so? It's very angry. Next. instead of bona fide specializing programs, women get gender mainstreaming, and gender mainstreaming is a pox for women. The worst thing you can do for women is fold their concerns into the mandates of UN agencies and bury them under activities of government ministries. Once you've mainstreamed gender, this is the bit, is everybody's business and no one's business. Everyone's accountable and no one's accountable. Next, please. So I think this needs some unpicking. We need to think about mainstreaming, which is a great idea, but how to make it work. And a good friend of mine, an architect, David Oakley, always used to say in his lectures, every good idea needs a home. And I think that what we see here is we need mainstreaming, but we also need responsibility. Someone's got to take responsibility for building laws, or for education in primary schools, or for flood protection measures using heavy engineering, etc. We need some kind of breakdown to make sure there's full accountability. There's got to be a home for an idea. There's got to be some person taking responsibility, even if it is mainstream. We don't want to lose that responsibility. Next, please. And this is the quote I have. When everything is everyone's business, it's nobody's business. I've long advocated mainstreaming DRR, but I can clearly see the risk of losing its impetus in a sea of competing agendas. Next, please. I think that DRM is too complicated and diverse to be fully coordinated from a single focal point. Just let's look at what's involved. Next, please. There's all these measures: insurance, education, training, public awareness, protecting lifelines, preparedness, national disaster planning, land use planning controls. Are we seriously thinking that any one agency or one person can control that lot or coordinate that lot? The answer is impossible. It's like life, it's coordinating a culture. So the best we can hope for is perhaps grouping it with task forces or some group that can actually try and bang heads together. This is a challenge though, because when engineers implement a safe building, they need these bylaws and they need to train, so there's lots of interactions going on. Next, please. So I think DRM is more of a culture, more a way of life. Next. Nobody really coordinates it. It resembles a culture, and can anyone coordinate a culture? Next, please. You can see that after a disaster you get a public outcry. It's getting bigger. Political rhetoric. We get logical arguments advanced about cost-benefit. And then you gradually get plans. And ultimately, maybe 10 years after, you get the beginning of a safety culture. And this is how the whole thing advances. And many of our disaster risk measures grew out of a single disaster where things have improved gradually. And that's probably how it happens. Next, please. I like Ban Ki-moon's comment. It's everybody's business. We've got to somehow get this out and about since everybody's involved in the process. Sorry, we're going over this stuff rather quickly, but you can ponder it later at your leisure. Next, please. It's a priority concern to get education. I talked about that earlier. Next, please. And rebuilding can involve some strange things. And when the Twin Towers collapsed, this cartoonist came out with this nice cartoon. We also need to rebuild global education and global communication. We've got other things to rebuild, not just buildings. And we can still see that when people talk about dealing with terrorism, they often neglect these other aspects. They talk about it in tangible terms, like how do we sort out the customs problems and so on, without realizing that we've got huge other agendas in dealing with trying to get a safer world for people. Next, please. Accountability, back to this subject. Next, please. When I was teaching in the School of Architecture, I felt I was accountable to the students, gradually more and more so, because the students, they were on our interview panels and they were doing assessments of my teaching. They didn't like my teaching, they wrote evaluations, and that caused real trouble for me and for my colleagues. And then they were on the validation boards, and the students were agitating for more and more power, and they got it. And in the end of teaching, after 19 years, I felt I was very accountable to my students, also to my boss. So I was doubly accountable. And one day I was arriving at the college, and a piece of equipment arrived looking like this from Japan. And this equipment was tied by elastic cords in its four corners, in its 8 corners. And it bounced around in the middle of this box. And it was quite safe, because obviously as it bounced around on an aeroplane or on a boat, it was kept safe by this curtain. And I suddenly thought, that's a bit like me, because I'm accountable to my boss vertically, but I'm also accountable to students. And then I suddenly thought, what about my work in disasters? And I felt I'm accountable to Tier Fund, or to the UN, or to the British government. Plenty of vertical accountability, but am I accountable for my book to the people in Andhra, or the people in Jamaica or whatever? The answer was, no, I'm not. No accountability at all to them. No downward accountability. And I still think that is missing too often in our system. So this diagram just is showing what we really need to be constrained with upward and downward accountability. Next, please. And we need an ethical base for our actions. We talk about strategy leading to tactics, leading to implementation, and we need monitoring at every stage. But too often we don't have that bottom one of core ethical values, which is the basis for this whole structure. And if we don't have a core ethical values, we're starting off in a kind of valueless world. So I'm really wanting to push here the idea that accountability is a lot to do with ethical underpinning. Next, please. We're nearly at the end, by the way. So, summarizing my reflections. If there are overall lessons, it's the need to become more accountable. We need to maintain and respond to the primary aim or central focus of any given activity. We need to regard each task from the point of need. Next. As an architect, I need to keep supporting disaster survivors rather than functioning, always designing. I need to support them in their action. Slightly back seat, a little bit back from the forefront. Next. As an NGO board member, resolving the problems and needs of an effective community rather than considering the internal needs of my own NGO. How can I keep the problem focused on the target? Next. As an academic, I need to teach students and facilitate training, not just adopt to the expediency of my university. Next. As an individual, I need to regard my work as vocational service, not just being preoccupied by my own career prospects. I can take care of itself. If I do good work in vocation, my career prospects will be sorted out. Next. And finally, I just wanted to show you just a few pictures very quickly of Malkonji, a little village in Maharashtra, near Latur, rebuilt after the earthquake of 1993. And I don't know if Mihir is in the audience. Hi Mihir. Mihir said to me in a meeting in Bangkok, having breakfast together, he said, why don't we go back and see what happened in Malkonji? We'd been there for an evaluation in 1996 of this project with quite a nice team of people. I think I was the only Brit there, but it was a very good team, good people, nutritionists and physio we had and planners and people. He said, why don't we go back and see what's happened 15 years later? I said, I don't know who'd fund it. And he said, well, do you need money? I said, no, I just need a ticket. He said, that's not a problem. You can get that from Tier Fund or something. So we went back in 2011, and this is what happened. Next. Next. One of the sketches I did in Latur in '93. Next. This was done, this drawing was to try and find out some information about these people. People stood behind me when I was drawing, and I was able to sketch down which shelter belonged to which family. Some of these kids could speak good English, which was very nice. Next. Slightly trimmer version of me in '96. Looking out at these houses, no trees had grown at that point. It was quite a raw environment. Next. Designed by a group called Development Alternatives, I think based here in Delhi, with a very good architectural input. Next. By Laurie Baker, who I never met him, I just had a great regard for this man. He was from Scotland, I think, originally, lived in India most of his life, married to an Indian wife, I think he lived in Tamil Nadu. Somebody knows? Kerala, right. So you all know about him. Is he well known in India?
Oh yeah.
Ah, sorry, I'm teaching you things you all know about. I liked his quote. My feeling as an architect is that we are not, after all, trying to put up a monument which should be remembered as the Laurie Baker building, but Moham Singh's house where he can live happily with his family. Nicely humble approach. And Laurie Baker conceived the concept for Malkonji, and Tearfund and Epicor, who built it, were wise enough to listen to him. Next, please. And he had this idea of a cluster layout, where people could bring their animals into the cluster at night, so they weren't going to be pinched from the fields. And these clusters could grow. So it was like a whole series of clusters, unlike many of the standard types of building, which was just a procession of buildings along a road to get cheap sewer lines. It was a much more creative approach. Next, please. I met this Mr. Rajan as a young man on the left and saw him again 15 years later, and he came to see me in '96. We were about to leave and said, what do? I was a farm labourer and now I've become a builder, and there's no more building, and if I want to do more building I have to leave and go to Madras or to Mumbai or somewhere. What should I do? And I said, well, I don't know your situation, but if I was you, I wouldn't budge, because he said, but there's no school here. I said, yes, but there will be, it's coming. How do you know? I said, I've seen the plans. He said, there's not a proper road. I said, they're coming too. And no buses, they're coming. And so when I went back, I asked if I could meet him, and he came along and told me, he came on a motorbike and said, I stayed. He has a bit of building work, he does farming, he's doing quite well in his family. Next, please. Next, please. Now the trees have grown. The neem tree, lots of people would get their medicinal needs from that, and the buildings look a bit shabby, some of them, but they're being added to and modified. The road's got a good tarmac, good bus route into Latur. And while we were there, Mihir and his team were gathering information about the economy. It did seem to be going quite well. I was a bit sorry they demolished all the old stone buildings, and we didn't think they were doing terribly good earthquake preparedness in the homes, but they were doing something on that. Next, please. She made a big difference. She was the headmistress of the school. She told the children to go home and use the toilets, and that got all the toilets into use. And she overnight, somebody said it would take 25 years. It didn't take 25 years. It happened very quickly, because they insisted the children use the toilets in the school and use the ones in the home. So these toilets were then used. Next. Kids learning computer skills. And it was not surprising that Maharashtra voted this. I mean, here they voted this as one of the best villages in Maharashtra or something.
No, it was a national award.
Was it?
The President of India.
Right. What was it given for? Because its success as a community was all
for the cleanliness of sanitation and water.
Right, because the water issue.
Water and sanitation.
And sanitation, right. Next, please. Jill with one of the kids in the school. Next. This was interesting. Tommy Swaroop from Epicor, he was one of the people who built it. He hadn't been back, he came with us. And when they were putting up the building, Epicor lived with the people building this project. They actually had they moved on tents onto the site. They weren't going to live in hotels, so they shared with the people this business of building. And they set up football clubs and things like that, and they really got to know the community. And when the end of the project, Eddie Mal, who was working with Tommy, said to the community, why don't you come on a tour of India? We've got some minibuses. Would you like to come with us? These people had never been anywhere much in the village, and they took them here to Delhi. They met their member of parliament. They had a wonderful tour, visiting projects. And this lady in here was 5 years old then. And we found faded pictures of that trip inside her house. Now she's married, and this is her son. And it was just so interesting to see what had happened in the community, of how the agency built this strong relationship. Very successful. Next, please. So here are some of the success factors. Good allocation policy by the local government, which was Praveen Pardeshi at that time. Financial support from the government and the UK government. This whole project cost only $750,000 by the British government. Tiny amount of money by modern standards. a sensitive architect with a deep understanding of the local culture, minimal relocation, excellent construction leaders in these two people, and an agency ethical with a fully development approach to the project. They didn't see this as a relief project, this was development. And they lived with the people on site. They had a training program for masons. They reused the stones from the old town as the foundation for each house. There was a headmistress who played a key role in the sanitation issue. And the big lesson I learned was to go for long-term evaluations. And I'd only done about 4 before, but I think in all projects, somebody should go back and look. We should return to see what happened. We should go back 10 years, maybe 15 years afterwards. I made a kind of mental note to try and go back and see more projects. Next, please. In contrast, this was what was going on nearby. And an agency which would be nameless put up these rather strange houses made of ferrous cement. And when Jill and I arrived there, these people thought we were from the agency, but we weren't. And they were moaning about the fact these buildings leaked and who was going to fix it. And they didn't know how to fix it. They got local builders in who didn't know how to do it. And they couldn't arrange the furniture in a round building. Where did they put the bed? Next, please. Lots of moans, and I don't know why those buildings were ever built, and they were fairly hopeless, but that's what happens in disasters. You get, next please, you get some very strange things happening. No user involvement, unfamiliar technology, problems with maintenance and internal space division. Next please. And that's it. I'm sorry I've taken a long time, and I do apologize for that, but thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you. But if there are questions, have we got time for a few?
Yes.
Yes. I'll stay here. Okay, I'll sit over here.
Presence of several distinguished members, but certainly I would like to recognize the presence of General Mawa as well as Kamal Kishore, members of NDMA. Welcome, sir. As I requested you, I would like to share some reflections from you, from what the experience is shared, of course, primarily built on both international as well as our experience. But how do you see any immediate thoughts you would like to share before we open the floor?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And for those of us who started work on disaster risk management with learning from Ian's first book, I believe in those days there used to be 2 books. One Shelter After Disaster and the other one Disaster in Development by Tony, which you mentioned very nicely as well. Those of us who started some 20-25 years ago will recognize that a lot of the things that we now take for granted, this whole notion of owner-driven reconstruction, putting the agency for reconstruction in the hands of the affected people, these things were not taken for granted like they are taken for granted now compared to 20 years ago. So I mean, you see reconstruction happening in Nepal, for example, reconstruction after Kosi floods. So, putting the agency in the hands of the affected people, recognizing the local initiative, local knowledge, local resources as a starting point or the add-on is something which has become default, that's the default position, and in no small measure it's because of the work of people like him. So, you can see the fruits of your labor right here. But I want to looking ahead, I want to share a few reflections. One is that a lot of the lessons that we've learned in disaster risk management, I also see a sort of a fossilization of approaches. So I mean, we are becoming dogmatic about some of the lessons that we have learned. And let's go back to again the notion of putting the agency back in the hands of the people. So, we had very successful experience of doing that in Gujarat. We have a very good experience of doing that in Kosi floods. And the same thing is now being applied in Nepal. But in Nepal, where the terrain is very difficult, if you come up with a system by which you say that, we will give you money in 3 tranches, and you spend it the way you want, with some technical oversight of quick resistance, This doesn't work because like to actually walk up to that village takes 2 days. So how do we sort of keep this whole thing really dynamic and not be sort of dogmatic about some of the lessons that you've talked about in practice and continue to improvise all the time and refine it to the context. There are examples of owner-driven reconstruction, and you go and see the pictures, and not even single house is different. All of them are painted the same. Chhaja is painted. What kind of owner-driven is that? We are just basically abusing the lesson and paying lip service to it, but actually it is not. So, I mean, the big question I have, reflection I have is, how do we sort of go beyond, how do we avoid the trap of turning these lessons into, dogmatic response? I think that's the first point. The second point is also the notion, you talked about the ball of the interconnected, complex problem of disaster risk management, that everything is connected to everything. And I think that really calls for a touch of humility in people who work on disaster risk reduction, whether we work in the government or we work in the NGOs or in academia. I sometimes think that we don't know the problem enough. You highlighted the work of Quarantelli. You were using a quote from 1972, and in 1995 he wrote a book, What is a Disaster? After 30, 40 years, he was still questioning what is a disaster. So that is the kind of humility we need. We need to recognize that we don't know everything. We don't know. There are lots of unintended consequences of our well-intended actions because of lack of understanding of the problematic of disaster, how disaster is accumulated. So I think that's a sort of call for all of us to sort of address. The third point I want to talk about is this whole notion of the core ethical values. I think that really has to be at the base of it, because while we can celebrate a lot of successes on disaster risk reduction, I also think that the pace at which the risk is accumulating, we are hardly even being able to, keep up with that pace, whether it's in the context of degradation of environment or urbanization. And that really gets down to the fundamental of what constitutes human well-being. And a consumerist society where having more, spending more, consuming more is equated with well-being is basically a recipe for disaster. That's right there is the underlying cause. And unless we sort of have the ethics of using the resources we have, I think all of that is really thinking at the edges of the problem. So those three reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kamalji. I would like to invite Abbas. Just a few comments.
I think, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Menon to have sent the invite to me, and it was very fascinating when I went through your CV, Professor, and the first milestone which I saw was 1973 onwards. That's how you work on the reflections of 45 years. And that was the year that I was commissioned into the service. So it made me start to think that yes, it is 45 years and you are reflecting on your experiences of disaster risk management. But when you went over your presentation, which was very interesting, I found that when one has, through my service career and in my present assignment also, you've been practicing various aspects of disaster risk management at various stages in life. The type of hats which you go on. Like, as an architect, though of course I am purely from a non-technical background, unlike my colleague Ahal. So, but then we were involved in ensuring, so recently, like people are aware that we are having a lot of avalanches in our higher regions in the Himalayas. So one was that position where we were looking at solutions to finding shelters which can be put up in those areas to prevent they getting destroyed by avalanche every year. And then subsequently I was also in Andaman where I saw this reconstruction, the type of shelters, all uniformly, I would say painted, designed by somebody from Noida, but put up in remote islands of Andaman Nicobar. So, that is where we've seen as to how the local knowledge and the local effort is not being directly taken into consideration. Likewise, talking about, you being on the board of directors or member of NGOs boards. We've interacted with a lot of NGOs who are operating particularly in the remote areas. The larger part of my service area whether it was in Northeast or in Kashmir. So in the remotest areas we find a lot of NGOs doing a lot of good work, and I can say that their effort is not being recognized. That is what is the experience that one has had. They're like unsung heroes. They've done tremendous good work for the community. And likewise, I have three important points to make. One is that I think there's been no solution to your mainstreaming. The disaster risk reduction is something which has been neglected, is what you stated, and whatever it is, and that is what we keep experiencing. And I totally share the views of Kamal to say that the risks are increasing every day. And though we might say that we've done certain things in certain areas, in certain spheres, but still, I don't think we have a kind of solution to the challenge of mainstreaming. Whether it is because of lack of funds or approach at the various levels is something which remains a big challenge for India today. And two other interesting things I found was I got to realize that disaster risk reduction is possibly a way of life. But I am very happy, sir, that today you said that it is the disaster risk reduction culture which needs to be imbibed. And that is what we need. And the core ethical values was again conveyed by Kamal. I think those are the takeaways from us. And it's been very interesting in yours also. Thank you.
Thank you very much for reinforcing what has been already shared. Sharanjit, so maybe what we'll do is we'll take two questions at a time, and for the benefit of everybody, just if you can also share your name and organization and then ask a question. If anybody want to comment, feel free to do that, but take a shorter time for a comment. You can take a longer time for asking questions.
Thank you. I'm Sarjeet. I work with UNICEF, ex-Oxfam, and long career, like not as long as yours, but yeah, similar. Architect. Many years ago, I think all of us who work in the shelter sector, came up with this idea that let's develop shelter sector strategy to solve some of the problems which you mentioned. And you mentioned that once in your presentation. I think I would like to have your more reflections on how are we doing in terms of formulating shelter strategies and sector strategies, and then running them, implementing them, and enabling various agencies to sort of work as per the strategy, and ensuring that the final sort of outcomes do happen. So I would love to have your reflections.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I'm Sunita Reddy from JNU. I really enjoyed your lecture. It was very informative, insightful, and also very inspiring. I have been working on disasters for some time from social science perspective, and working in the islands, I also realized the difference between the bureaucratic norm, which the government does and all the aid agencies does. There is a huge gap between bureaucratic norm and the emergent norm, which comes from the people, and especially looking at long-term rehabilitation. And very well you spoke about more from political economy perspective, more from social science perspective, though you're a technocrat. But then that all these issues are so important. And one sentence which is there on your write-up on the second page, where you have said about India, that India possesses all necessary skills in abundance, but then is a political problem. So I'm really impressed with that statement, because you've rightly caught that we all have this potential to mitigate disasters, but then we really have to look into the political issue. And one more comment, and I would like to have your reflection on community participation, which you said, when you look at community participation, it can be just a token, on one extreme, it can be complete collaboration where it starts from policy to planning. I think that's where we need to really understand when we talk of development and bottom-up approach when we are talking on the rehabilitation. And I'm really glad that you brought in all the no-go areas, which we always shy away from talking about, whether it's corruption, whether it's about power relations, whether vulnerability. The point which you raised about the risk people have to be told. So I'm just wondering whether we really need to tell people about the risk, because in Indian context, many times they understand the risk, but they are so vulnerable and there's no other choice. So whether it's marginalized communities who are at the low-lying areas or on the floodplains, so basically they know the risk, but they tend to live there again and again. So those are the reflections, and maybe a comment on that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting comments, and Kamal's comment is a very interesting one. I mean, even in producing reactions to the situation, the last thing I would hope for is any kind of new dogma. I think in any situation, any rule can be broken because the circumstances are so different. And there will be places where user-built housing just won't work. There are circumstances where you must have provision. And so I think any of these rules have got to be handled by people who are well-trained and flexible, adaptable, but try to keep certain principles to the front. You know, for example, trying to keep their core values and trying to understand people and also becoming more accountable to them. That will have all sorts of consequences. So I hate to think that we'll have more dogma. I do agree with you, and I hate to think that could happen. I think the idea of trying to each think about the issue from that person's standpoint and that person's point of view is not easy. It's very hard to empathise with a poor person. When you've got reserves in the bank and when you've got all sorts of privileges, it's extremely difficult to do that. I've often found it very good to work with local leaders in these situations, and some of the best conversations I've ever had have been with local advocates. It might be a priest in a Latin American town, or it might be a school teacher, or it might be somebody who's not in the political realm, but they know the community very, very well. So I mean, one principle I always have is seek out the neutral people in the community and get to know them and find out what they know their people very well, and they can often articulate, and they can also be their advocates. Shelter strategies. Well, and I think it would be terrific if we could develop the shelter strategy. For example, in Haiti, I wrote a book about that, and it's one of the strategies was to say, do everything you possibly can to strengthen people staying with relatives. If people have gone away to stay with their family, or with their relatives, or with other people, strangers even, the government could, particularly in earthquakes where they have to leave their houses because the house is shaking, if it's there, it might be dangerous. The government could give support to that process. The government might want to find out where those people are. They might give them grants to the relatives to help support them. And they need to keep in contact with them. I was very surprised in Kobe after the earthquake there, which is where I first met Mihir. And Mihir and I were doing work in Kobe after the 95 earthquake. And I said to the minister responsible, I said, there were 350,000 people displaced by the earthquake. How many of those went to stay with relatives and family, friends? He said, we think between 40 and 60,000. I said, where did they go? He said, we have absolutely no idea. I said, did they come back? He says, we don't know. We think probably a lot have. I asked the same question in New Orleans when I was there after Katrina. I asked an official, I said, how many people were, and again, they have very partial knowledge of the whole process. So the first thing is, shelter strategy is, you need to know what the situation is. And if you can support people in being away from the area temporarily, while work's going on, that would be a very important strategy. Another one would be to provide them with tools, expertise, to help them. If they're getting hold of building materials via Western Union to help patch up their house, there's a huge need for technical support. And we need a form of barefoot architects, barefoot engineers to be around in these places to say, we have a clinic and we'll give you help on what to do and what not to do. So when I was in Haiti, I met an engineer from Quebec, and he said, I can't talk to you for long because I'm very, very busy. I said, I quite appreciate that. What are you doing? He said, I got to visit about 25 houses today to help them. I said, why are you doing that? And he said, well, that's my job. I said, what is your job? He says, to reduce risks here. I said, well, why are you visiting 25 houses? Why aren't you training Haitian engineers to do that? He said, because I want to visit the houses. I said, you want to visit the houses, right, now we understand. I said, but couldn't you be training people to do your job? And you could multiply it many, many times over. And so another shelter strategy might be to see how you can work with local professionals and technical people to get them into the driving seat of the situation. If there's a shortage of local engineers, maybe people have to come in, but they're often neglected while others come in. And one problem is the NGOs have their own network and they would hire people rather than use local people. And so there's a real tendency to bring people in at great expense when they could be using local people. In the paper I commented on a previous Indian minister who buttonholed me at a meeting near here at a conference in the early 90s and said to me, what skills do you need in disasters? And I told him some of them. He says, which ones do we lack in India? I said, you don't lack any of them. You've got them all in abundance. He said, so why are you here? I said, well, because you invited me. That's why I'm here. But he was onto a good thing there, because he was saying, why can't we use our local people more in these situations? And I think he should be. We need registers of competent people who can be used, and there's too much. I've often felt when I've been involved in these things that I'm wondering why I'm there, why it's not being done by local people. So we've always tried to work with local people, but it could be done much better by them. So the shelter strategy would be to do with human development, it would be development principles, it would be a whole range of different options, and it would be different for every single place. And I think it would be put together by local stakeholders who know the situation. I'd want someone like Laurie Baker around. I'd want some engineers who are socially responsible. I'd want some psychologists around and social workers and people like that. And we could develop strategies. Just in an afternoon you could have it and not apply formulas, not use books, work it out and see if it doesn't work, change it quickly, keep it very agile. Another question was about tokenism, community participation. I think it often is, but anyone who's worked with communities knows how rich they are and how effective they are, even if they're not agreeing. There's lots of diversity in the community. What they want this, they want the other, and there's those kind of things. But getting them going on it is fantastic, and how quickly people respond to those kind of issues. I have a friend called Everett Ressler who used to work with UNICEF. And he worked in a refugee camp on one occasion. And he was in Kowloon after the Kampuchea emergency. And Everett said he was with a team which were going to design the camp. And a man came to see them who was a dentist and said, why are you designing our camp? He said, well, I've been hired by UNHCR and others to do that work. He said, well, we should be designing the camp, you see, not you. And he said, I will come here tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning with a plan for the camp which is agreed by the community. He said, how can you do that? We've scheduled 4 weeks to do that consultation. How can you do it by 7 tomorrow morning? He said, we'll work all night on it. He said, but we have all the contacts. And they arrived with a piece of paper with the plan for the camp, and Everett had it framed in his living room. That was the plan for the camp, and they largely followed it. They designed the camp, and it was just because they got together and they worked, and this man was a local leader, and Everett said, I never felt so redundant in all my life. He said, I wasn't needed. And so there's often huge resources there to mine and to capitalize on. Do we need to talk to people about the risks they face? Well, maybe you're right, maybe we don't. Maybe people do know them. But lots of the people in Sichuan who died, they didn't know they were in such an earthquake-prone area. and they didn't know the schools were badly built. They probably never would know that, but they had very little knowledge of the extent of their vulnerability, and that was partly why they were so distressed when they were grieving. They'd lost the one child in their family. They're really angry about that. They only got one child. They only allowed one child. That child's dead. So they were angry with the government, and their protest was, why not be told about the risk they had? So maybe some people do know, maybe some don't. But I think we should always check to see if people do know, make sure they are aware. If the government knows, they've got to share it. That's the principle, I think.
The second point she also made, lack of choice. Risk lack of choice.
I don't know if I know the answer to that at all. Maybe people are so constrained and so poor, and many of the people in Nepal are in that sort of situation, and they have to accept almost an inevitable situation. But can you elaborate a little bit and explain where you've met that situation, where people have been completely powerless?
It's basically any situation for that matter. If you look at the floods, recurrent floods in most of the states, whether UP or Bihar or Assam, so mostly the same communities get affected, and within the communities also there are certain groups which gets much more badly affected. Yeah. Or if you look at the urban spaces, the low-lying areas, or where it can be flooded or inundated. So one has to do more of empirical work to see which exactly the communities which gets affected, whether it's recurrent floods or urban floods.
And it's very difficult too for people who depend on that location for their living, fishermen who depend on that river for their fish and they're in a vulnerable position, or people living on steep slopes because the only land they want to farm is the flat field they've got, so they wouldn't put their house there. And we did work in northern Pakistan in Karakoram, and all the people were living in the most dangerous sites so they could farm whatever flat land was available. So they're making choices. So we said to them, but you know the risks you face. They said, yes, but we do things. So we said, what do you do? They said, well, we tie ropes across the river, and when it flash floods, the bells ring, and we run like hell up the field. We have bells ringing at night when there's a rain, because we think there might be landslide. Quite a lot. Can I just ask me here that same question about lack of choice? I mean, how do you deal with that situation where people are almost so poor that they have no choice in the situation? You must have met that many times.
This means it's the right time to join the conversation.
One doesn't know enough, but the situation is very common, at least in the communities that we have worked with, all across the state, including the states which are well-to-do and well-prepared and vibrant and best models in terms of recovery, as well as where things are not quite up to date, both economically and the disaster risk. I think 2 or 3 things one has observed both from tsunami recovery and also one of the recent, just very recent visit to the Gujarat earthquake recovery, that people who didn't have choice, and then what happened. And 2 things have happened. One is obviously those who fall down and further and move out. And that has happened to a small degree, but that does happen. A lot of migration is because of that. And the second is where they've either come together around the idea of work, organized around livelihoods and work. They've done somewhat better, and they had a choice to exercise, where they've come together as some groups to demand for their basic rights, human rights, and they've done better, where they've come together and joined up with a local or maybe even outside international organization in some cases to press for the demands, not in their own voice, but through somebody else's voice to make a difference. Those are the areas where...
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe before that, just I would like to... Sure. Sorry for being a chair, that's the thing I want to exercise. I think the issue of lack of choice, this is also the area where you did touch base about the social issues like gender-based discrimination, some of the cultural practices. Often we are also noticing, not only in India, some of the South Asian countries, where the whole concept of the social exclusion. There are certain social issues that continue to put certain communities more vulnerable, not by their choice, by virtue of their where they're born and which group they belong to. So therefore, where it's not that they have their choice, but also they are not forced to exercise their choice by virtue of these social institutions. So perhaps that's an area which quite often it is coming, whether it is an issue of in the tsunami, where the manual scavengers are forced to, without proper gaze, were asked to clean the whole process, and where the basic human rights issues being abused. But when the questions, when the media and some of the civil society raised it, oh, by the way, there are manual scavengers that are supposed to do that. So what it reinforcing when the issues of disasters happen, where the resources are less, and both the power and people who do not have the power are equally constrained with the lack of opportunity and resources, the social practices are reinforced and much more force. That is where the explosion of issues of social exclusion and issues of discrimination based on identities such as caste, ethnicity, gender, single women being excluded. These are the questions that are coming. I think that's an area which many of us are grappling with, but that's an area which we would like to flag on as one of the issues. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Actually, I just thought that this is an extremely thought-provoking conversation, and I want to acknowledge the fact that General Marva mentioned that the culture change which is required. When you actually look at the collective responsibility. If people are staying in vulnerable areas because of socioeconomic deprivation and poverty, can we look at legislation? Can we look at ways by which support could be provided to have flood protection or landslide protection, and to ensure that they actually have some way of recovering from or able to withstand disasters if it happens. I recall that FEMA has a policy that if people stay in floodplain zones, they are not entitled for compensation. That's a very harsh stand, but then if we actually can understand the kind of compulsions which force people to stay in these kind of vulnerable areas, can we work with communities? Can we have a kind of collective responsibility to work as academics, as practitioners, as civil society organizations, and as government to try and see that there are some risk mitigation measures which are being brought in. That could be one of the issues which we could actually collectively discuss.
Thank you, Viren, for raising that issue. Before that, Pushti, please.
Thank you, Professor Ian Davis. I'm one of the millions of your admirers for your work for so long. I have 4, it could be questions or it could be comments, as you may take it. The first one is that you have made a statement that mainstreaming is a difficult and doubtful, and you have made it a little grey area. And at the same time you also mentioned about the root causes. So if you really if somebody wants to address the root cause, obviously you will find that root cause is emanating from those areas of other areas of development. So mainstreaming in one way makes sense, but I thought that you probably contradicted your own statement by addressing root cause and mainstreaming. And
so what was my? Can you spell out my contradiction? Just
I'm thinking this in my mind that root cause. You also talked about very strongly that root cause, understanding of root cause is critical to address the issues in disaster risk reduction and all that. But at the same time, you also at later stage you said that mainstreaming is ambiguous and difficult and all that. So I want to make a statement here that when we are still struggling to identify, demystify mainstreaming, so what are the tipping points, how we go about it, and you are making a statement that mainstreaming is ambiguous. Does it probably it is qualifying or it is supporting that insensitivity to mainstreaming? This is one point. Second question is that you spoke very strongly on local capacity building, and you talked about risk-informed community. You talked about training and education and things like that. And I want to just ask you that how do you look at the entire value chain of local capacity building, from risk awareness to through skill, through training, knowledge through education, and advanced knowledge through research? How do you look at the value chain on capacity building? The third question is that how science and technology is struggling, or science and technology is making strides to impact the improvement in quality of life, changing quality of life of people. How do you see that this science and technology will be sensitive to future risks and disasters? And the fourth and the last one is that you talked very strongly, I'm extremely delighted to find your statement on ethics, integrity, and this echoing around by Kamal's making a statement in support of that kind of thing, and every day we experience that. I want to share one thing, that in 90s, I think some early 90s and all that, Transparency International talked about the most honest country, and probably Singapore was on one of the top. And then at the same time, the most dangerous countries, it talked about India, China, Malaysia. And then that time I was thinking that, look at Singapore, it consisting of people from India, China, Malaysia, and that means people from three most dangerous countries could create the most honest country. So the problem of ethics and integrity really doesn't lie with people. Where it comes from and how do we really address this issue equally? And disaster risk reduction is a big casualties on compromise on ethics and integrity.
They're terrific questions. I mean,
Not necessarily all that needs to be answered. I can take the first one first.
well, the first one about root causes, I don't think that is, in my mind, connected with mainstreaming. I just see the root causes as these fundamental problems that say for gender inequality. You have countries where girls are not taught to swim because of gender issues. Boys go to swimming classes, the girls don't. The girls can't swim, and they're wearing clothes which might be difficult to swim in, and so on. Now that's going to take a huge amount of education and courage to tackle that issue. If there are Iranian girls living beside a big river, I can't see any reason at all why there shouldn't be a kind of the UN said every child to learn to swim by the age of 7 or something. If you had a kind of leadership from the UN to say that, you could have separate classes for girls to swim in swimming pools when the boys are not there, and so on. There's all sorts of ways around these problems. But the root cause is one of gender inequality, and probably mixed up with prejudice and traditions and so on and so forth. And I think that has to be dealt with by somebody, maybe by NGOs, maybe by the educational system, maybe by local leaders, certainly not by foreign experts, that's for sure, and not by writing books. It's going to be dealt with by local people who are agitating and trying to do something. If they're successful, there'll be consequences to that, and those consequences will be for the good of the society. The corruption one will have to be faced, and I believe it is being faced. The World Bank are providing guidelines on how to avoid corruption in projects. And maybe we'd like to see corruption talked about a lot more. I'd like to see architects and engineers signing a kind of oath, a bit like the medical profession, to sign an oath which says that I will in my work adopt ethical approaches. I will never specify something which is, etc. And I can't see why we can't have a culture which gives professional responsibility to try and tackle some of these entrenched issues. So the root causes, I think, need to be tackled so that we can then not just tackle the cosmetics of risk, but find out what's driving it. These are risk drivers. The mainstreaming one seems to be absolutely clear-cut. We need it. We need the education authority to make sure that every school is safe, and the education authority to make sure that every child gets an education in risk. I don't doubt that. I'm just concerned that the mainstreaming, there are pressures on it which people need to be aware of. I was asked to go by British government around their offices to talk about mainstreaming into their aid programs, and every office we went to, we were shown the door by people. They said, why do you want to give us more problems?
We've got enough problems to worry about. Are you going to give us checklists? We don't want any more checklists. One man said, I've got a gender checklist, I've got an environment checklist, I've got checklists for everything. He says, are you giving me more checklists? I said, I don't know, I'm just telling you this is a very important issue. He said, I'm sure it's important, all these issues are important. He said, please leave. So off I went, and we were shown the door in almost every example. And I had some sympathy with him. I thought it must be very difficult if you're a public official. But then I thought, no, I should say to him, look, you're sitting in this comfortable office because I'm paying taxes, and your job is to do this job properly. And if there's a risk in your aid programs, you've got to take account of disaster risk. So get with it. This is really important. So I can see that we need it. The argument I was trying to put by that writer was that we may be losing responsibility through mainstreaming. And we've got to think of a way of keeping responsibility active. And I believe it should be, for example, in the schools question, the Department of Education should be responsible for the safety of all schools and the curriculum, not the Disaster Management Agency. The responsibility should be where it belongs. The Department of Health needs to make sure that new hospitals are all built to adequate standards. It's not the Department of Disaster. The responsibility goes with where it is the home. And there's maybe one man designated or one woman designated in that organisation to look for gaps and see if it fits. So I can see the argument for mainstreaming, but I don't think it's connected with I don't think I'm contradicting myself in seeing that in root causes. So maybe explain that a bit. I don't know about these other questions. I don't see how science, I think science and technology is absolutely astonishing because we're seeing such good progress being made in so many areas, particularly in the IT area. And maybe that's going to become a much better way. For example, getting warnings out on people's mobile phones. Wonderful. In Los Angeles, everybody gets a warning, and we can have that in any country. Paging systems can be adopted. We're going to see big cuts in casualties through these kinds of systems. But every system brings its own problems. I mean, I was talking to somebody about the tsunami warning system in the Indian Ocean. And I said, it's going well, isn't it? He said, well, it's going well, but we have problems. And I said, what are the problems? He said, well, we have these buoys which float about in the ocean, and they receive the information from the seabed, and they send a signal up to a satellite, and the satellite analyzes it. He said, when we designed the system, we never knew those buoys would attract fish. I said, why do they attract fish? He said, I don't know. You ask the fish. He said, the fish congregate around the buoy.
Because of the light and also because of the sensor activity, they tend to gravitate towards the...
So the fish go there, and the fish attract the fishermen. The fishermen then come to fish, and the fishermen see there are batteries on the buoy, which would be nice to steal. So the batteries are taken away, and the whole system is destroyed. So now they're exploring solar panels to see if they can think of a way whereby the fishermen won't wreck the system. But it's just that every solution, there's a downside to it, like those stupid gates on the Thames flood protection, the human error. We've got to look with all these technological systems to say where is the human error going to happen? There's always going to be human error somewhere. And to be wise enough to keep identifying it, and that might be a need for training or double checking or somebody's job. And sometimes I've met people in my travels who are very, very good at this. I met a man once who was emergency planning officer for Oxfordshire. And he came to me and I said, how do you update the rules? He said, that's very difficult. He said, because the risks keep changing and the regulations keep changing and the guidebook changes. I said, so what do you do? He said, well, I'm responsible for 30 officers, and I have to make sure that they're up to date with what happens. So we have training courses. He said, so in the back of my car, I keep all the guidelines, and I visit each one of them, and I say, do you know the change that has happened in the regulation? He said, often they've changed jobs, they're new people, and they don't know. So he's like, I tell them what to do. I go through it with them. He says, and I visit every one every 2 months. I said, is that your job? He says, no. No, that's not my job. I do that at weekends because I have to do that. And this guy, he's enlarged his job to fill a gap, and he's coping with a real issue just out of sheer responsibility. Every now and again you meet people who are amazingly responsible, and he's seen a gap in the problem, and he's trying to keep it up to date. So I'm always staggered to see public officials who go beyond, they go the extra mile, as it were. And there's such a lot of goodwill in the world that you see amazing things happen. We met in, and also at the community level, in Colombia, there was a flood problem in a ravine. And the head of civil defense said, I've been asked to go along and meet them. I don't know who they are, but they're dealing with a flood problem by themselves. So we went to this ravine, and the people there were fishing for gold in the river, because gold came down. And people had to live by the river. And there was a woman who had a tobacco shop, and she sold cigarettes and sweets. And she could see the problem, because they had a flash flood, and 5 houses were destroyed. So she arranged an exercise in the middle of the night and days for evacuation exercises. And they found out that the old people couldn't move as fast as the younger ones, so they swapped houses. The older people moved up above the water level, and the younger ones who wanted to be near the river came down. They just saw and then they developed an evacuation system, and all he had to provide was signs. And I realized that lots of local people can manage their own risks very effectively.
So, Raj? Yeah, very quickly. In terms of learning, we always found that most of the learning, it is always based on success and best practices and stuff like that. So I was wondering, from your experience, if you could reflect something on failures. Like, has there been any sincere and open effort on failures and things that didn't work?
Yeah.
Has there been any sincere effort by the disaster risk management community to reflect on those failures and things that didn't work?
Failures of learning or failures of advice being given?
Yeah, both. Learning and advice, both.
Yeah.
And most of these things quite often are not highlighted. We always celebrate success and best practices.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm really personally very excited to meet you because you brought me to DRR after quite some time. I was working in Prevention Consortium and got a phone call with you. You don't know me, of course, but you spent sorry, we'll talk later. No, what I want to say is I would like to have a quick word from you on where you see DRR today. I mean, a lot of all what you said, very valid and very good points. Of course, we have been here and elsewhere reflecting after all these conferences in the landmark year 2015. So maybe some eagle-eye perspective after so many local good insights and the real causes, but where do we stand? How do you see these things evolving? I mean, you have three visiting professors, so you have a lot of exposure, so some insights there would be helpful.
Sorry, can you remind me what the insights are about? You want to?
No, I would like to get your perspective where you see DRM, because I mean, there's a lot of problems you refer to and repeating, and this is indeed but we had 2015, and so, yeah, it's like a new era to some extent.
Okay, the failures. I think there are lots of things which we've seen people put in guidelines and teach, which maybe weren't accurate. I mean, for example, sometimes people have exaggerated risk above everyday needs. I mean, we used to have a thing whereby we always said that all houses in earthquake areas should have doors that open outwards. You don't open inwards, so people can rush out of the house without having to open the door inwards, because it might get in the way. And one man from Guatemala said to me, he says, you know, we did that advice, but every time I open the door, I knock the visitor over, because I opened the door out. And he says, and these people are knocked on the floor. He says, you give them crazy advice. He said, he said, we don't have earthquakes every day, but I have visitors every day, and every time I hit them with the door. So I thought, you know, this is an example of a stupid rule. We haven't thought it out in terms of everyday needs. So maybe all the advice we offer about risk reduction behavior needs to be tempered by what makes practical common sense. We need to work that all out. I was in a church in Andhra Pradesh, and we were giving a course there in Vijayawada about disaster risk, and there were lots of church pastors there in a course that FEBUARY organised, and I said to the pastors, I said, do your churches have two doors? One at the front and one at the back? He said, no, only one. I said, well, you know, you have lots of activities in the church, and if there's a fire, people could be trapped. So why don't you have an escape door at the opposite end? He said, because it's obvious why we shouldn't, because people will come in and steal the chairs. He said, we have a big enough job stopping one door. So he said, theft is a big problem here, so we only have one door. He said, the risk of robbery is much more important than the risk of fire. And so it was just a very interesting, you know, thing about life. So I just feel one lesson for me is make sure that the advice being given makes practical common sense for everyday needs. And if it doesn't, maybe it's not a good thing. And I think there have been mistakes in the way we've trained. I think we often train very passively with learning by rote and not enough activities. And the best training we've done, when my colleague, we worked in Calcutta, we all went out and on the railway line and met a community that were living by the railway line, and that was the best bit of the course, the field work. So every course I was happy, and I always try to get out and about and visit people and see what's going on. And you get real live learning happening in those situations. So that's one lesson. In terms of where DRM is going, I personally think that we need a bit of a rethink. We've had 10 years of UN IDNDR, we've had the Hyogo Framework, we've had the Kobe conference, we've had Yokohama, Kobe, now Sendai. And I think, why more of the same? Why not now say we've got to think differently about it? We've got to stop international agendas and programs. They're not really working. We've done enough of that. They're costing a fortune in people traveling to these conferences. We could have regional meetings for the people in South Asia who are working in, where they have to do joint hazard work. In the Mekong, they've got to work between Laos and Cambodia, they've got to work together. So the regional meetings are very important, but there's no particular need for lots more global things, which are taking care of lots of carbon problems with the huge air tickets. So I'd just like to see a very much more localized kind of approach to risk reduction. And maybe trying to involve much more the people who are actually practitioners. I went to the World Earthquake Engineering Conference twice in Auckland and Vancouver. There were 4,000 earthquake engineers there, 700 from Japan. These are people who spend their livelihoods dealing with risk. And to some extent, they've been doing it very, very well and very effectively. So I think that the professional groups could do a lot more, and we need to recognize them. We need to get together, the river catchment people, to work together, land drainage, water irrigation, flood problems, and get them to actually think together about how they can better integrate their work. And a lot of conferences about bringing together like-minded people, I think, would be very useful. Curriculum work, I think, is very important. Architects are not being taught enough about risk anywhere. And we need to get the curriculum changed. We need to teach people much more, and that would require the validating institutions to work with. I think they need to be brought in line and help to try and see what kind of curriculum is needed for it. And just as the medical profession has developed barefoot doctors and barefoot midwives and barefoot, these getting knowledge down to and they've done it with agriculture extensionists. We need that to happen with building very urgently. But I like the idea of Tony Gibbs, an engineer in Barbados, who said we need a double system in most countries. We need one system of bylaws and land use controls for the middle classes and above. And we need another system for the people who can't afford them. And that would be by example, by small grants, by giving clinics and advice. He said they can't afford the bylaws. So a country would have dual systems. He said the obstacle is that the governments would have to recognise those slums as being legal. They don't want to recognise that. So that's the obstacle. The obstacle is the legality issue. But I think, he says, pragmatism is needed. We need pragmatism to recognise the problem isn't going away, and we need to think out more creatively how to tackle it. And I loved his thinking. I thought it was very, very sensible. If we could only accept the fact those slums are not going to go away in a hurry, how can we work there creatively to try and encourage people to be stronger with better upgrading programs? I would love to think that in India there's new thinking about urban management, because the risks are increasing. To see the way this country is growing is phenomenal. I did an exhibition about India in 1962 and I checked the population and it was 464 million. Well, now it's 1,200, 1,300 million. So there are 3 times as many people as there were when I was in my 30s. That's phenomenal growth, and it's an achievement that you've managed to feed all those people and also to stop them having huge disasters. I mean, it's a great achievement that that's happened, but what's the new thinking? Can we have urban task forces trying to bring together specialists to say, how are we going to tackle Delhi and the flood problem in Delhi? Bring the best thinking together and maybe localize this. Or maybe a comparison between the flood problem in Mumbai and Delhi and how these 2 cities, which are both strategically crucial for the world economy, not just India, how can they share information about tackling the flood problem by structural measures or by non-structural? Who's going to give the thinking on that? And promote those kind of initiatives. You can be very proud of what you've done here. I mean, it's an amazing achievement, and I think you've got a lot to share with other countries. It's always a joy to come back here because there's such a pulse of excitement and energy, which is wonderful. So just some thinking. I'd like to think more about that, but thank you for the very good question. I do remember the conversation with you too, so thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time. But there's a dinner time, that time we can also interact. But if anybody would like to ask any pressing question or any comment you want to make, you can raise your hands, then accordingly we can allocate the time.
They're all getting very hungry.
That's good. Yes, please, fine.
Yeah, I'm Harshan from FEBUARY. It was very happy to just, you said you make a comment, and it was a privilege to listen from you to instrumental in the Maharashtra Latur housing program and the disaster program. So then I was, there were some notes where it's like how that community participation comes, like in the same way you also intervened in tsunami response, that the community participation was like being with the planning was done by the community, and especially fishermen community, they don't want toilet inside. They want toilet to be put it in outside. That was a suggestion given by the thing, like so. It is that was when we go there, and it is that changes and community adaptation and that environment friendly the environment is to be created. So you also mentioned about the two things like structural, what challenges we face in India. That is what I just wanted to say that two things you mentioned about the structural measures and non-structural measures. And so where we make a preparedness in the community level, the non-structural part is missing because of course we develop a disaster management committees and preparedness team and task force and things like when we make it, but the non-structural part of like ethics and integrity and things like service providers services, which is not the community goes with the team goes, but we have a during post-flood and during flood and prior to that what's supposed to be done, like also like various concerned department. Even we have various districts, we have a district disaster management plan, and it is been not properly implemented in the various thing like, and service providers, maybe we can say it's a negligence also, or that commitment to provide the services in that is a challenge we face in India to come, prepare the community to, with the local resources to taking the local resources and prepare the community to face the disaster. That is a joint effort. That is a challenge we face. Thank you for all the things that you highlighted and reminded us. And when we sit here, it's a GNGO, and to have that commitment to go ahead to the three occasions like to prepare the communities.
Yes, just a very quick response. I think that it's almost difficult to get the full range of measures that are there, like the non-structural measures, like teaching people local capacities and what the kids can do at school and what the adults can do and how they can manage their own risk. And sometimes there are structural measures mixed up with that. For example, in flood areas, make sure all the electric points are 1 metre up on the wall and not on the ground level, so you don't knock out your valves on your WCs so you don't have water coming up. And there's practical things that can be done, these sandbags and divisions on the wall to stop the water coming in, and hard surfaces, making sure that furniture can be moved around. But it's a huge challenge. The exciting thing is, though, that for very poor people, these non-structural measures don't often cost much money. They can be very, very cheap. And just 2 stories about that. One was in Vietnam, seeing the schools taking their geography teachers out in the village and marking the trees with flood levels with the date. So they've got flood maps, and they consulted the older people to see when the floods happened. And you see these brightly coloured bands on trees. That cost a bit of paint. And somebody I know in Jamaica, she did a remarkable thing where she worked with a group called Homeless International, and they could see all this pollution from people burning rubber tyres in an area of very steep slopes where there had been landslides, and she hit on the idea of maybe they could use the tyres to help stabilise the slopes. So she went to the people burning the tyres and causing all this smoke to saying, could you give us the tyres rather than burn them? They said, well, you can have them, we don't want to burn the things. So she goes to the local authorities and said, if we put tyres on the hillside, would you provide free of charge plants to plant in the middle of each tyre? They said, yeah, of course, we can help with that. So she goes to the village and says, we've got lots of tyres, will you tie them together to form a lattice on the hillside, north, south, east and west? Each tyre is tied to another tyre on the most vulnerable slopes. They said, yeah, we can use that for free. So they started fixing tyres on the slopes. The people came along and planted trees in the middle of each tyre, seedlings. And within about 5 years, all those tyres had disappeared into the undergrowth. They were covered with soil and planting. And they certainly minimised, they didn't solve the landslide problem, but they minimised it. They stopped the burning of the tyres. And this problem, as she said, cost absolutely nothing. So, I mean, we need creative solutions at village level and simple ways whereby, why have a risk map in a book when it can be on a tree, when it can be on a lamppost in every flood-prone village in India? Just because you get the school teacher to take the kids out and do that. I mean, there's a lot of risk reduction at non-structural can be done very cheaply. And I want to deprofessionalise as much of this subject as possible. We need to do a kind of even lineage kind of thing. Schumacher, get it all down to the local people as far as possible. And a friend of mine in Nepal, he said, we don't have to have earthquake engineers like me here to tell people about risk. We can get local people to understand it, and we've got to see that as a challenge. He said, but the trouble is the engineering profession doesn't like that because of professionalism. We've got to get rid of this barrier of professionalism, and I'm all for that if we can do it. So I feel you're in a very important position, all of you working in NGOs, to be able to implement these things, and all power to your elbow. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, friends. We come to the end of the program. I think I'm not going to dare to even to mention that long list which we need to, I think, grapple with. Perhaps maybe it calls for one more event to discuss some of those challenges and how do we take it forward. And certainly, I think what people also reinforced, what we need is a humility and learning from the experiences, learn from the mistakes, belief in the local system, and the communities build their capacities. At the same time, fixing the accountability and the responsiveness. I think these are the key words in your accountable. And how do we reinforce? I think it is an important area, but it also calls for how important that one being an expert and a professional, but being willing, working together in an alliance of mutual respect and the contribution of each other experience. I think that's the key to the success that we can make. And with that, I would like to invite my colleague Shivani to propose a vote of thanks shortly.
I feel honored and privileged to get an opportunity to prepare a vote of thanks for this occasion. On behalf of Change Alliance, Spare India and our supporting partners, I may like to express our sincere thanks to Professor Ian Davis for giving the excellent reflection on 45 years in disaster risk management. I pay my gratitude to Professor Vinod Menon for bringing him here with us, and also Mr. Anand Kumar from Change Alliance for chairing the session very well. Then I also convey my thanks to our distinguished participants who came from distant places actually to attend this important event. And ladies and gentlemen, once again I want to state we all are most grateful to Professor Ian Davis on the stage. And we thank you for being with us this evening. It was really a great pleasure for us to have you here. Thank you very much, everybody. So dinner is ready outside, and please have your dinner here.
And I think we also would like to recognize the co-contributors Oxfam India, Islamic Relief, and Spear, and also Swami Shiksha for supporting quite quickly and responding to us to organize this. Thank you very much.
Can I just say, Vinod, how can people get hold of this if they want this stuff?
Yeah, actually, we would like to just mention that there are two things happening. We are also trying to get this entire talk uploaded on YouTube. We will send you links. We have the registration sheets with the email IDs. So we will send you links to the talk and also a copy of the presentation, soft copy of the presentation. You know, it's a very big file. So, but we will send you the link so that you can download that. We will send it on Google Drive. Okay. And thank you very much for being with us this evening, and thank you. Look forward to continued interaction.
Please join us for the dinner.